The night cracked open with the roar of flames. The wind carried the scent of burning timber, and the screams of the dying wove through the darkness like the cries of lost souls. Inside the Whitaker cabin, Eliza clutched the edge of the table, her breast shallow, her heart pounding against her ribs. The front door trembled on its hinges as heavy boots slammed against it. Her father had already taken up his rifle, his face tight with the knowledge that he would not live through this night. "Stay hidden," he whispered to her, his voice rough with urgency. He pressed a shaking hand to her shoulder, then turned to the door just as it burst open. A warrior stood in the threshold, framed by the hellish glow of the burning settlement. His face was streaked with war paint, his eyes unreadable, his blade already wet with blood. The rifle roared, but the warrior moved like a shadow, slipping past a bullet. The knife found its mark before Eliza's father could fire again. The world turned to chaos. Her mother screamed. Eliza bolted for the back door, but strong arms snatched her before she could reach it. She fought, kicking, twisting, but her captor's grip was iron. She barely registered the guttural words spoken around her, the Apache warriors communicating in a tongue she did not understand. A war cry split the air, and then she was thrown over a horse's back like a sack of grain. The earth swayed beneath her as the warriors rode out, leaving fire and death in their wake. She sobbed into the coarse mane of the horse, her tears mixing with the grit of the trail. The cold night air lashed against her, but nothing could dull the fire of grief burning in her chest. Her family was gone. Her home was gone. She was nothing now, just a prisoner, a trophy of war, carried deep into the unknown. Hours passed before they finally stopped. The camp was hidden in a narrow canyon, the firelight flickering against jagged stone. Eliza was dragged from the horse and shoved to the ground. She barely caught herself on scraped palms before rough hands yanked her upright. Her head spun as the warriors circled her, speaking to one another, their voices edged with amusement, indifference. One of them, a tall man with braids and a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. He studied her, then turned to the others and spoke a single word. Laughter rippled through the group. Eliza didn't understand, but she knew. She was no longer a person. She was property. She shuddered, her body stiff with fear. But then there, a pair of dark eyes watching her from the edge of the firelight. Not with cruelty, not with amusement. Something else. Nail. He had fought alongside them tonight, but his hands were clean of blood. He had stood apart when they ransacked the settlement. He had watched Eliza when they rode. And now, as the warriors discussed her fate, he watched still. A war raged behind his eyes. He knew what would happen to her. He had seen it before. He had done nothing before. But now, something in him resisted. The chief spoke, and the warriors moved. The one with the scar reached for Eliza. She shrank back, but there was nowhere to go. The warriors laughed again, low and knowing. The man gripped her chin, turning her face one way, then the other, as if inspecting a horse at auction. Nahel exhaled slowly. Then he stepped forward. The laughter stopped. The scarred warrior turned to him, his brows raised in surprise. Nahel met his gaze, expression unreadable. Then he spoke, a single sentence. Tension crackled in the air. The warrior's hand dropped from Eliza's face. He muttered something, then turned away, shaking his head. The others exchanged glances but said nothing. The decision was made. Nahel had claimed her. Eliza's breath came in short, uneven bursts. She didn't understand what had just happened, but she felt the shift, the way the attention of the warriors drifted from her, the way they left her standing alone in the fire's glow. Nahel stepped toward her. For the first time, she saw him up close, his features sharp but young, his dark hair tied back, his gaze unreadable. He reached down and cut the bindings from her wrists. She flinched away from him. He sighed, as if expecting it, then turned and walked away without another word. Eliza stood there, her wrists raw, her mind a blur of terror and confusion. She was still a prisoner. But now, somehow, she belonged to him. The silence of the night was thick, broken only by the low murmurs of warriors settling into sleep and the distant howl of a coyote. The embers of the fire pulsed like a dying heartbeat, casting jagged shadows across the canyon walls. Eliza sat rigid, arms wrapped around herself, her body aching from the rough treatment. But the pain was nothing compared to the raw terror coiled at her chest. She should have been too exhausted to think, but her mind spun in frantic circles. She could still feel the weight of her father's hand on her shoulder, hear the gunshot that failed to save him. Her mother's scream had been swallowed by the night, and now the only sound left was a pounding of her own pulse. She had to escape. But how? The warriors slept close to their weapons, and the horses were tethered near the fire. Even if she ran, she wouldn't get far. The land beyond the canyon was unfamiliar, wild, vast, and merciless. The very thought of it paralyzed her, but staying was worse. She was trapped, caged within the moment that had stolen everything from her. Movement at the edge of her vision made her tense. Nahil, he stood a few feet away, just beyond the firelight, his gaze fixed on her. He had barely spoken since claiming her, his face an unreadable mask. She didn't understand him, didn't know if she could trust him, but there had been something in the way he had looked at her, something different from the others. Now he crouched down beside her, his voice a whisper. "Do you want to live?" She recoiled, startled. His tone wasn't mocking. It wasn't cruel. It was quiet, steady. Her throat tightened. "What?" He glanced toward the sleeping warriors, then back at her. His expression was hard, unreadable, but there was no malice in it, only resolve. "Run," he said. "Now." Her breath hitched. She searched his face for some trick, some hidden motive, but found nothing. Her pulse slammed against her ribs. This could be a test, a trap. If she ran and was caught, they would kill her, or worse. But if she stayed, she knew it would come. Nahil's hand moved, so quick she barely saw the blade flash in the moonlight. The bindings around her ankles fell away. She hesitated only a moment, then she ran. The cold air tore her lungs as she bolted into the darkness, her bare feet scraping against the rocky ground. Her heart pounded like a war drum. She didn't look back. She didn't think. She only ran. The canyon walls stretched high on either side, a jagged maze of stone that swallowed the moonlight. Shadows twisted and blurred. Her legs burned. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but she forced herself forward. A shout rang out behind her. They had seen her. Panic surged through her, white-hot and all-consuming. She stumbled, nearly falling, then pushed herself harder. A second cry followed the first, angry, sharp. The warriors were awake. The hunt had begun. A sharp tug yanked her backward. She gasped, fighting. Her nails clawed at the hand that had seized her wrist. But then she saw his face. "Nahil, quiet," he hissed. She tried to wrench free, but he didn't let go. Instead, he pulled her deeper into the canyon, dragging her behind a cluster of boulders. Footsteps pounded against the dirt, voices cutting through the night. The warriors were close. Too close. Eliza pressed a hand against her mouth, choking back a sob. If they found her, she was dead, and so was he. Nahil's grip on her arm was firm, but not cruel. His breath was slow, steady. He was listening, waiting. A figure passed just beyond the rocks. A shadow against the moonlight. Eliza didn't breathe. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, finally, the footsteps faded. Nahil didn't move until the night was silent again. Only then did he release her. "Come." His voice was low, urgent. She didn't argue. She followed. The canyon stretched into endless darkness, its narrow walls twisting into an unforgiving labyrinth. Nahil moved quickly, his steps light, his body poised with practiced ease. Eliza stumbled after him, her body weak with exhaustion and fear. They walked for hours, maybe longer. The night was a blur of cold and silence and aching limbs. Finally, when the moon hung low in the sky, Nahil stopped beside a dry riverbed. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You cannot go back," he said. "You understand this?" Eliza swallowed. Her throat burned, raw from thirst and fear. "Why are you helping me?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked away, his jaw tightening. "Because I did nothing once." She didn't understand, but there was something in his voice, a weight, a buried pain. She didn't ask again. Instead, She sank onto ground, exhaustion finally overtaking her. She curled into herself, shivering. The night air was unforgiving, stealing the last of her warmth. After a long pause, Nail sat beside her. He didn't speak, didn't look at her, but after a moment, he pulled his blanket from his shoulders and draped it over her. She flinched at the gesture, unsure if it was a trick, unsure if kindness even existed anymore. But the warmth seeped into her bones, and for the first time since the attack, she let her eyes close. When she woke, the world was painted in pale dawn. Nail stood a few feet away, his gaze scanning the horizon. She sat up slowly, the events of the night crashing back into her like a wave. "We must keep moving," he said without looking at her. Eliza pushed herself to her feet, every muscle aching. "Where?" He turned to her, his expression grim. "To a place that will not find you." She stared at him, uncertainty clawing at her insides. She was trusting a stranger, a warrior who had fought beside the men who had taken everything from her. But he had saved her, and now he was all she had. The wind howled through the canyon, twisting between the jagged rocks like a living thing. Eliza trudged forward, each step in agony. Her bare feet were torn, her body weak with exhaustion, but she forced herself to move. To stop was to die. Nahil walked ahead, his movements effortless despite the rough terrain. He had barely spoken since they had fled the Apache camp, his focus trained on the land around them. Every few steps, his gaze flicked back, scanning for pursuers. He had not said if they were being followed, but Eliza could feel it. A tension in the air, a whisper in the wind. They were not safe. The sky, once a pale dawn, had deepened into a bruised blue. The heat bore down on them, relentless and unyielding. A river had once cut through this land, leaving behind only parched earth and brittle bones. There was no water, no shelter, only the vast emptiness of the wilderness stretching endlessly before them. Eliza's throat burned with thirst. She licked her cracked lips, tasting nothing but dust. How much farther? Her voice was barely a whisper. Nahil didn't answer. He only gestured for her to keep moving. Frustration clawed at her. He had saved her life, but he barely spoke, barely acknowledged her except to give orders. And she followed because she had no other choice. A sharp snap echoed through the canyon. Nahil halted, his body going rigid. His hand went to the knife at his belt, his gaze sweeping the rocks above. Eliza's breath hitched. She turned, heart hammering, searching for the source of sound. A stone tumbled down the slope behind them, dislodged by something unseen. Not something. Someone. Nahil grabbed her wrist, pulling her forward. "Run." She didn't hesitate. The world blurred as she sprinted beside him, the dry wind clawing at her skin. Rocks shifted beneath her feet, sending her stumbling, but she forced herself onward. Her lungs burned. Every muscle screamed. A sharp whistle cut through the air. Nahil swore under his breath. "They've found us." Eliza didn't dare look back. They reached the end of the canyon, where the walls widened into open desert. There was no cover, no place to hide. Nahil turned sharply, dragging her toward a cluster of boulders. They dove behind them just as a gunshot cracked the silence. The bullet struck stone, sending shards flying. Eliza pressed herself against the rock, her chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. Nahil peeked around the edge. "2 men," he murmured. "1 rifle." Her stomach twisted. "Settlers?" He shook his head. "Bounty hunters." She swallowed hard. They weren't here to save her. They were here for him. Another shot rang out, chipping the rock near Nahil's head. He didn't flinch. Instead, he grabbed Eliza's arm and whispered, "When I move, run for the riverbed. Don't stop. Don't look back." Panic surged through her. "What?" He was already moving. Nahil sprinted toward the left, drawing fire as he disappeared behind another rock. Eliza's breath caught. For half a second, she hesitated. Then she ran. Her feet barely touched the ground as she tore across the open space. A bullet whizzed past her ear. She kept going. The dry riverbed was ahead, an uneven, jagged drop into the earth. She threw herself forward. The impact jarred her bones, knocking the breath from her lungs. She rolled, dust clouding around her, and lay there, panting. Silence. She turned her head. Nail appeared at the edge of the riverbed, dropping down beside her. His breathing was steady, but his hands were red. Blood. Her stomach lurched. "You're hit." He ignored her. "We keep moving." She stared at him, at the crimson streaks across his fingers. Then she nodded. They moved deeper into the riverbed, its winding path a shield from their pursuers. The further they went, the quieter the world became. Eliza's legs trembled. Every step was agony. After what felt like hours, Nail finally stopped. "We rest here," he said. Eliza sank to the ground, pressing her forehead against her knees. The heat, the fear, the exhaustion, it was too much. She felt Nail crouch beside her. "Drink," he said. She lifted her head. He held out a canteen. She took it with shaking hands and drank greedily. The water was warm, metallic, but she didn't care. When she handed it back, he studied her. "You did well." Something in his voice, something unexpected. Approval. She swallowed hard. "You got shot." He glanced at his arm. "It's nothing." She frowned. It wasn't nothing. But she didn't argue. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Then Nail spoke. "They will keep hunting." She met his gaze. "So what do we do?" His expression darkened. "We survive." The trading post loomed on the horizon, a small cluster of weather-worn buildings surrounded by a rickety wooden fence. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the scent of horses, sweat, and dried meat clung to the air. It was civilization, or something close to it. To Eliza, it was salvation. Nail stepped slowed as they neared. His eyes scanned the outpost, his body taut with unspoken tension. He had led her here, but now, at the edge of the settlement, something in him hesitated. She turned to him. "We made it." His expression didn't change. "For now." She swallowed, gripping the tattered edge of the blanket draped over her shoulders. The last few days had carved something raw inside her. Fear had been her constant companion, but now, beneath it, something else had grown. Resolve. Nail had risked everything to bring her here, and in the process, she had changed. The terrified girl who had been dragged from her home in the dead of night was gone. In her place stood someone else, someone who had bled, fought, and survived. She stepped forward. The moment they crossed into the settlement, eyes turned toward them. Conversation stilled. A woman carrying a basket of flour froze mid-step. Her gaze locked on Nail. A man leaned against the post of a saloon, his expression shifting from curiosity to something darker. They weren't welcome. A man stepped forward, broad-shouldered, sun-leathered, and armed. His eyes flicked to Eliza, then landed on Nail with open disdain. "What's this?" Eliza straightened. "I need help." The man's lip curled. "That's so." His gaze lingered on her torn dress. The dirt smeared across her skin. He didn't need to ask what had happened to her. The answer was written all over her. A small murmur rippled through the settlers as others gathered. One of them, a wiry man with a holster slung low on his hip, stepped closer. "Girl, that redskin take you?" His hand rested on his pistol. Eliza's blood ran cold. "No," she said firmly. "He saved me." A sharp bark of laughter. "That's so." The man tilted his head at Nail. "I say we string him up anyway, just to be sure." Nail didn't move. He had expected this. Eliza's hands clenched into fists. "He saved me," she repeated, louder this time. The first man held up a hand, silencing the murmurs. "No one said you weren't in trouble, miss. We can help you." His eyes flicked to Nail. "But we don't take kindly to his kind." Eliza's pulse pounded. She knew what was coming before it happened. The wiry man stepped forward, hand tightening on his pistol. "I say we don't waste time." Eliza moved without thinking. She stepped between them, raising her arms. "Stop." The crowd hesitated. She turned, forcing herself to meet each gaze. "You want to kill the man who risked everything to save me? Then you're no better than the ones who took me." Silence. Then, from behind her, a slow clap, A figure stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, taller than the others, wrapped in a dust-covered coat. His grin was wide and lazy, but his eyes were sharp, cold. A bounty hunter. Well, now, he drawled, "Ain't this something?" Eliza's stomach twisted. The man tilted his hat back. Been tracking an Apache. Heard he took a settler girl. Got myself a bounty to collect. His gaze flicked to Nahil. And look at that. I found him. Nahil's expression remained impassive, but Eliza felt the shift in him. He was preparing for a fight. "No," she said, stepping closer to Nahil. "You don't understand." The bounty hunter moved fast. He grabbed her, yanking her to the side, his pistol drawn in the same motion. Nahil moved faster. In a blur, he twisted, knocking the weapon aside. The shot rang out, shattering the moment into chaos. The crowd scattered. Eliza hit the ground hard, rolling to her knees. The bounty hunter spun, pulling a knife as he lunged. Nahil met him mid-strike. The two men clashed, the blade flashing between them. Nahil dodged, sidestepped, his movements fluid, controlled. He struck, quick, precise. The bounty hunter staggered back, blood blossoming on his sleeve. Eliza scrambled to her feet, her heart slamming against her ribs. The bounty hunter's eyes burned with fury. "You're dead, savage." He went for his pistol again. Eliza didn't think. She grabbed the fallen rifle at her feet, lifting it with trembling hands. "Stop." The bounty hunter froze. She steadied the barrel, her grip white-knuckled. "You take another step, and I shoot." A slow smile crept across his face. "You won't." Eliza's hand shook. He was right. She had never killed anyone. She didn't know if she could. But Nahil had saved her life. And now she had to save his. The bounty hunter moved. She pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the air. The bounty hunter staggered, clutching his side. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't getting back up any time soon. Eliza gasped, the rifle slipping from her fingers. Her whole body trembled. Nahil caught her arm, steadying her. His dark eyes met hers, something unreadable flickering behind them. "You did well," he murmured. The settlers, once ready to turn on Nahil, now stood frozen, silent. Eliza turned to them. "You wanted to kill him," she said, her voice hoarse. "But he's the only reason I'm alive." The first man, the broad-shouldered one, stepped forward. He eyed Nahil, then Eliza, and after a long pause, gave a slow nod. "Take your horses," he said, "and go." Eliza exhaled shakily. Nahil wasted no time. He grabbed a horse, mounting it in one swift motion. Then he reached down, offering his hand. Eliza hesitated. She looked at the settlement, the people watching her. This had once been the world she knew, the world she had been stolen from. But it wasn't home, not anymore. She took Nahil's hand and pulled herself onto the horse. Without another word, they rode. The desert stretched before them, vast and endless, the horizon painted in gold and fire. Eliza didn't know where they were going, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid.